why do you think so many couples fight about money?
So the biggest reason couples fight about money is because they don't have a budget. But maybe putting it more, the real reason really couples and everybody fights about anything is because of unmet expectations. And budgets actually get your expectations together. Because I think, you might have a somewhat of well, here's about how much we're going to spend each month, but then you in your mind have an idea of something that you want to buy and you've been thinking about it for a while, and then your spouse has also been thinking about something, and so we can easily justify what we do and then get mad at other people for doing what they do. So the biggest reason we fight about money is because we have unmet expectations of how we thought it was going to be spent, which is remedied by having a budget.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think another thing that makes money conversation so difficult is because there's so much emotion and feeling and power behind it, right? We all work hard for our money, so we feel entitled to our money. So it can be really frustrating, and just the stress elevates so high when we feel like our spouse isn't being responsible with our money or isn't spending the money how we think it should be spent, because we feel this like ownership for it. So I think that can be really challenging.
Yeah, again, that goes back to actually having a budget and following it, because in your mind, you've worked hard for your money, or your spouse has, and you guys, however you want to spend it. And so you have something that you've been wanting for a while and you thought you've been patient, but then you never told your spouse about it. And so then you get upset because you both have different ideas and you've never communicated what you actually wanted to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And by having a budget and making a plan, it can help remedy those solutions. I think another reason some couples fight about money is because they aren't thinking about creative solutions to the problem. Because so often when the money conversation comes up, we instantly kind of get pitted against each other, like it's my plan versus your plan. It's my desires versus your desires. Instead of saying, really looking at the problem and doing what Dr. Kim talks so much about that turn, that pivot of let's stop fighting each other and let's start fighting the problem, and really looking at the problem and looking for creative solutions to stuff. So I know one conversation that I had with someone just recently is the wife really wants to stay home with the kids, but the husband wants her to work. But so they're just arguing back and forth about this again and again, but they haven't even talked about their expectations of like, well, what does the income need to look like? What does their budget need to look like? Maybe the problem isn't work versus no work. It's like standard of living, and like, what do you want? And is there a way to do that with her staying home? I think so. I think you can come up with creative solutions a lot of times, but it's hard to do that when you're pitting against each other.
Yeah, unmet expectations.
Yeah, definitely. So why do you think it's important for couples to budget?
So unmet expectations, but even more so than that, it's when you have a budget, you actually can talk about what you want, what they want, and then you can actually come to an agreement about what is appropriate and what is okay. Because I even, hear couples a lot of times even say things like, well, generally speaking, this is how much you spend, and so as long as I don't spend, anytime I spend under this amount, I don't have to ask my spouse. Well, the problem is, what if you do that once a week? Well, or once every couple of days? Like, that just doesn't really work. And so it's important to budget so that your expectations have been communicated. And if there is something that goes wrong, you both have, like, when there's no expectation and somebody spends money that maybe they shouldn't have spent, you can get upset about it, but you can't really get too upset about it because you never communicated what's okay and what's not okay. And it really defines and allows what is in bounds and what is out of bounds. So it makes it kind of clear. Maybe this sounds bad. It makes it clear who the culprit is, so you can find a solution in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. I think for us, we've been really blessed that we started a budget really early on in our marriage in the beginning. And that was due to Dylan, not due to me, hence me asking him the questions when it comes to the budget. But he got me set up on a budget even when we were first engaged. And so we really haven't had a lot of arguments about money in our 9 years of marriage. And when we do have arguments, it's, like you said, it's really clear. It's Christina did something she wasn't supposed to do, and I didn't follow the budget. And so it's easy to take ownership of that and to handle that, and it's a quicker solution. And then I think another reason it's so important for couples to budget is because then you don't have to talk about every purchase. So I know for me personally, it would drive me crazy if every time I got home from Target, Dylan was asking me how much money I spent at Target. But because we have a budget and he knows I'm going to input it in the budget and then I'm going to follow the budget that we work together and have agreed upon, I don't have to tell him every time I spend money, and he's not checking in on me every time I spend money because he trusts that I'm going to follow the budget.
Yeah, I mean, money's one of, if not the biggest thing couples argue over. And so that really takes the arguments and the fights out, because there are plenty of other things to fight about. And we'll talk about, the spending and saving in a second, but it makes it easy to not have to, if you are someone that's very budget conscious, to not every time something is purchased have to have a conversation, because there's trust and there's, you just had to do this. The only conversation that we have about budgeting or about money comes about once a month when I have to email Christina to ask her to update the budget.
Yeah, that's about
Because
it.
I'm in there updating the budget and I see her purchases haven't been updated in like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot of the fighting and the disagreement away. And like you were saying, you don't have to, every time your spouse comes home with a bag from somewhere, you don't have to be like, what'd you buy now? Because there's a budget and you don't have to ask for every small purchase.
Yeah, definitely. It cuts down on the agreements a lot. So, speaking of budget and why it's so important, how can practically couples make a budget work for them?
This is where it's hard. Is I tell people if you can commit to a budget for 3 months, then you'll be able to make it. But what gets difficult is tracking what you spend gets annoying. You miss a few things. You'll say you'll do it later, but you don't have the discipline or habit of actually doing it later, and you don't really know how much you spend on what. And so the first couple of months of budgeting is not only frustrating because you have to get into the habit of tracking and updating and all that sort of thing, is you don't really actually know what goals you're supposed to be hitting. So some of it is just like, I was way off here, and that can get frustrating. And so practically, it looks like talking about it. We use a Google Sheet, something that we can both update independently online, something like that. And we can do our budgets and different categories. Of course, there's other options out there. But practically, what it looks like is talking about it. Know it's going to take a few months to get it on track to where you want to be. But actually, basically, it comes down to the discipline of updating it every day for at least a while until you get where you want to be. It becomes a habit, becomes a lot easier to stay up to date with.
Yeah, and I would just echo that absolutely. I think it's for me, this was foreign to me when we first got married, but it's one of those habits that once you actually implement and have it as a habit, it's really quick and it's really easy. And the great thing about it is it makes you more money conscious. So before budgeting, I couldn't tell you what I spent last week, but now because I'm in the habit of updating the budget on a regular basis, I'm not having to pull up receipts or even look at my credit card statement. I know the amount that I spend at each place because it just gets embedded in your mind and it makes you more aware of the money you're spending, which means you're going to be a better steward of what God is giving you as well, which is really awesome. And then another practical note that has made budgeting better and easier for us, practically speaking, is we round up to the dollar because we can do simple math in our head. But if we were trying to mess with cents, I would have to get a calculator out on my phone every single time. But just rounding up. So say I went to Target and I spent $12.37. I'm just going to round that up to $13. And then I can do simple math on our detailed account spending and then add that to our overall budget for the month really simply.
I agree.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So the next question I'd love to ask you, Dylan, we're different. I'm the spender and you're the saver. Can you speak to the savers that are out there about how to deal with their spender spouse?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this, again, comes down to most couples don't have a budget. And having a budget that you don't really follow or update is not a budget. And so what happens is you in your mind, again, you have expectations of how people should operate with their money, and then your spouse doesn't operate that way. And you get really frustrated when it's not all on your spouse if you have not come to an agreement and actually followed through and talked about what you want it to look like. And actually a budget is we think that budgeting is only good for spenders because they spend all their money. Budget, I would say, is equally as good for savers because savers need to spend money. Because being miserable and increasing your bank account is not fun for anybody. We do have to live our lives a little bit. And so I can speak to the savers, those that are like me, that not only does it get you on the same page because you've had expectations, so you can't, if something is overspent, you're justified in that frustration. You can't be justified in that frustration if you don't have a budget. But in the same way, savers can actually spend money and actually live their life a little bit because they know that it's okay and that they've planned to do so. And without a budget, you don't do that either. And so your spending spouse can rightfully be upset with the saving spouse for never spending any of the money that you've earned because you haven't planned to spend it as well. So I think it works both ways. I think a lot of times we think budgets are just good for spenders, but they're also good for savers because it helps your sanity, knowing that it's okay for people to spend money. And it helps you live your life a little bit because you've budgeted beforehand to do so. So every time you go out to eat or every once in a while when you do something you enjoy, you're not in the back of your mind freaking out of like, I shouldn't be spending this money.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll speak to the savers as well. I would just encourage you, something that's been really great for our marriage is Dylan recognizing and understanding that I do need to spend money to have fun and to enjoy life. And so even when we were making minimum wage and you were in grad school getting your master's, I had a coffee budget. So like that was like my fun budget. So I could go out to coffee with my friends and enjoy a latte and all of that good stuff. And so recognizing that your spender spouse is going to need something like that. It's going to look different for every couple. Every person's going to look different. Maybe it's going to be eating out. Maybe it's going to be a shopping. Maybe it's going to be a Target budget. But your spender spouse is going to need to spend money. And so even if it's a small amount, giving them that freedom of their fun money, making that budget line item, I think is going to be
Yeah,
really
that
important.
sounds a little weird, but I mean, you can have like an allowance portion of your budget where your spouse that wants to spend money can spend whatever this percentage, whatever this amount of money is, like whenever they want, however they want, wherever they want. Again, it's just putting in the budget so there's expectations, and then there's not a lot of friction and frustration when money's actually spent.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I'll speak to the spenders out there. I would just encourage you when it comes to dealing with your saver spouse to remember that it's a good thing to save money and that they are wanting to save money not to keep you from having fun, but to plan for your future. And that's a wise thing. And then I would also just encourage all the spenders out there that as you're spending money, to make sure you're also considering your spouse in that, right? So like for Dylan and I, like he said, he never wants to spend money. And so when I'm doing the spending of our money, I need to also consider Dylan and make sure all of my purchases aren't just for me and what I want, but to really consider Dylan in that as well.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as far as money conversations go, they can get really intense really quickly. How would you advise our listeners today to talk about money with their spouse?
Have a budget? No. But this is where it all starts. So unmet expectations is the number one reason conflict is created and it happens. And so you need to talk about, I mean, your family history and dynamic plays a lot into what your expectations are. But coming to expectations of what it's going to look like, which is why it takes a few months to actually put your budget into place. But you need to talk about it. You need to communicate kind of what you are thinking, what you want, why. Again, a lot of the reason we get frustrated is we know the reasons why we think what we think, but because we never communicate them, our spouse doesn't understand where we're coming from. And so it's not, I mean, the simple answer is you need to create a budget. But the budget is just kind of the culmination of all of these conversations and talking about why you think what you think and what you want to do. You love your spouse, and so you are on the same page. And again, frustration happens because expectations that you guys never communicated. And so I think understanding where each one is coming from makes it a lot easier to kind of move into the same direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought up family of origin. I think it would be really healthy for everyone listening to this video to go and sit down with their spouse and just ask them, what did money look like growing up? How was it handled? How did money conversations go? Who taught you about money? And just really gaining an understanding of the textbook that we're kind of bringing into our marriage when it comes to money. I think that would be really wise.
I guess I'm more of a saver, but I also grew up. I had an allowance. We tracked everything. My parents followed a budget, so I was trained, I guess, in ways that you weren't.
Totally.
And so that also brought into kind of what we're going, kind of the background behind how you see money, the way you do it. And again, those conversations happen when you actually sit down and have them, and it enables you to come to an agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. And for speaking from someone who didn't like the idea of a budget and didn't want to have to deal with the details of that, I can just speak to how much freedom it has actually given us. I think when people think budget, they think, oh, you're restricting me, you're taking away my freedom. But it's the exact opposite. When you actually have a plan and have a budget, it gives your finances so much more freedom, and you'll be able to be a much better steward of what God has given you.
Yeah, budgeting is so that you can actually experience freedom and not stress. We think budget, we think boring and discipline, and nobody wants to do that. But it's actually for freedom. I mean, it's the same way that people that are proactive with their time and they calendar their time ahead of time are typically more efficient and productive. They all have the same amount of time in the day, but you've planned ahead of time how you're going to spend your time. You're more likely to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish. And the same is true with your money. When you plan ahead of time what you want to do, it allows, for example, even from the beginning when we had no money, our first few years of marriage, we still took vacations. We didn't have debt. And sometimes people will, we would have friends or whatever who made a lot more than us be like, oh, that's so unfair. You guys are going on a cruise. I wish I could do that. And I never would say anything, but it made me so frustrated because I was like, you have no idea how hard we've worked to get here. Mm-hmm. And so it allows when something breaks down with your car for you to afford that and not being stressed out about how you're going to buy groceries or fix your car in the same month. Budgeting equals freedom. It takes work to get there, but the cons, I guess you could say, of the discipline of it are far smaller and a way more minimum than the pros of having a budget. Again, not just for your financial sake, but for your marriage sake and the lack of disagreement and arguments that you don't have to deal with when you've come to and shared your expectations about what you want to do with your money.
Yeah, and it's fun too. Like it's fun to be able to accomplish things together as a couple when you make a plan and you have a budget and you're able to do cool things like go on a cruise or whatever that may be.
That's right.
Yeah. So when, say a couple has a budget, they're following it, and then a disagreement arrives, whether it is someone didn't do what they were supposed to do when it came to the budget, or they're disagreeing about how to budget. How should those conversations go when you're at odds with each other?
So again, for one, I would say those conversations are way less dramatic and upsetting when you actually have a baseline, because normally you just come into this conversation of I want to do this and I want to buy this and how dare you. It makes it a little easier to even have those because you actually started somewhere. I don't know that I have a magic answer, but again, I think talking about it, adjusting your budget. So if Christina comes to me as more stereotypically more the spender and wants to buy something, maybe that's not in the budget. We can't have the conversation is actually quite simple. What do we want to move around? Because regardless if you have a budget or not, you can't, you have your income that's coming in and it's probably not going to be changing a lot from month to month. So if you want to spend money you don't have and put yourself in the debt, okay. But if that's not what you want to do, a budget just shows you the reality of the financial situation that you're in. I think a lot of us don't want to have a budget because we just don't want to know what that is. But the income's not really going to change. And so it makes the conversation a lot easier. Okay, if we do this, what do we need to take money from? Because it's not like this is just free money that's going to come out of nowhere. And I think it helps the saver say, okay, we can spend money because we're going to change it. And it makes the spender say, okay, if I actually want to buy this, where am I going to sacrifice? And it makes it a lot easier to get on the same page where if you don't have money, you never talk about your expectations, or you don't have a budget, it makes that really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say as you're having these conversations where you're at odds with one another, I would just encourage you to go about it gently and to go about it without assuming, right? So ask your spouse good questions about what they want to accomplish, what they're wanting, and the reasons behind it. Don't come into it assuming. I think it's really important when it comes to any conflict in marriage to remember that your spouse is not your enemy. Your spouse loves you. Your spouse wants good for you. So remember that when you have these conversations.
And I would say, too, if there's been something that you've been thinking about for a while that you wanted to pursue, you wanted to buy, and you bring it to your spouse, and your spouse's initial reaction is, no, we're not going to do that. And then you get upset. Remember, you've been thinking about this. This is the first time they've heard it. So you've had time to kind of figure out and kind of plan out how you might want to approach this. They haven't. So you have to give your spouse time whenever you have maybe a bigger purchase that you've been thinking about. You got to share it with them sooner rather than later and give them time to also think and process and pray about it as well. You can't just say, I've been thinking about this for 2 months and we're going to do this now. That's really unfair to your spouse.
Yes, you are a team. I echo that 100%. Well, this has been a great conversation about how to make a budget work for you as a married couple. If you liked this video, we would love it if you would go ahead and click subscribe and make sure you hit the bell so that you get notifications every time we post a new video on the Awesome Marriage YouTube channel. And if you enjoyed this video, we would love to hear from you. So comment down below, tell us what you do to budget, tell us any questions that you might have when it comes to couples and budgeting, and share this video with a friend. Post it on social media. We love it when you do that. We love seeing you engage with the content, and it is a true gift to the ministry of Awesome Marriage when you do that.